We are effectively an alliance, but also an umbrella organisation that seeks to represent the concerns of civil society around the world. And although we're a global organisation, we're headquartered here in South Africa, and with some good links with our South African civil society colleagues. We're here today because it's the end of a very long and arduous process of compiling our annual report. It's several hundred pages worth of a stock take on the state of civil society around the world. I'm relatively new to Civicus. This is just the end of my third month. And I think I came into this job rather naively thinking that the argument for a healthy and vibrant civil society as a fundamental building block of democracy had long been won. That every government in the world, that every key institution had bought into this idea that you need a vibrant, independent civil society. In fact, in many countries of the world, civil society is under greater threat than ever before. We've been lucky enough to get two very high-profile people contributing forwards to this report. One is Jay Naidu, who those of you who are South African will know very well, social activist, founding Secretary General of COSATU, minister in the first post-apartheid government, who in his forward, and I really recommend you read it, talks about sort of growing ferment in the world and the sort of the disconnect between leaders and citizens that has led to people taking to the streets, not just in North Africa, but also in Chile, in Quebec, and of course, as he says, in the deadly struggle for a decent wage of the Marikana mine workers in South Africa. So, if I could ask my colleague Sienna Marie Pegas to give us a snapshot of this year's report.
The report is a product of an alliance. This report is coming from civil society on civil society. This report is not ours alone. So we have diverse contributions from across our network. So we have contributions from Asia, from Africa, from Australasia, from the Middle East, from the Pacific, even from the Caribbean, that's where I'm from. Over the past 5 years, the Edelman Trust Barometer has shown that CSOs have consistently scored higher ratings of trust than governments, the private sector, and the media. We've seen attacks on activists, which is in 2012 we saw 24 human rights defenders killed, human rights defenders attacked in 28 countries, judicially harassed in 40 countries. And these threats are not only coming from the state, but they're coming from corporates, they're coming from militant groups. And also, we've also seen more than 800 cases of attacks on writers in 108 countries. And in Latin America, I mean, that's where the context for human rights defenders is particularly grave. We've seen threats to environmental activists, writers, journalists, trade unionists. So I think this is an area where we really need to focus on as civil society. And I think it's important to say that government should acknowledge CSOs as civic actors in their own right. And this is happening there's a good example of this from our contribution from Kyrgyzstan, which deals with the Public Watch Council system, which indicates the role of civil society as a consultative body for ministries and also as a watchdog for ministries. We've also seen a few civil society voices in the mainstream media. And civil society also seems resigned to the fact that matters of importance to us will not attract mainstream media coverage. I hope some people in this room can, you know. But I think the whole idea of civil society not being able to attract mainstream media coverage is the fact that we are not necessarily communicating messages in the best way and in the most media-savvy way.
Kate Tissington from SERI to talk about their contribution to the report, please.
We're at the moment we're sort of following the Marikana Commission, and it's become a very big focal point in South Africa, in a sense, a defining sort of moment in our post-apartheid history. However, it is far from an isolated incident of protest that ends in violence. And protests, whether involving striking workers or local communities, is becoming an endemic feature of South Africa's socio-political landscape. According to research undertaken over the past few years, there are three interwoven features in all protests. First is high levels of poverty and inequality, in the context of a middle-income country like South Africa. The second is inadequate basic services like water, electricity, housing, etc. And then the third is the fact that in all instances, protests occur following repeated attempts by community members to engage with authorities over problematic issues. However, when it comes to protests, and in 2012 we saw some of the, I think it was the 30% of the protests that took place in 2004 took place in 2012 alone. So it's clearly increasing. We've witnessed an increasingly authoritarian state response to protests, often resulting in the use of force and sometimes lethal force.
Henriette Esterhuisen from the Association for Progressive Communications to talk about their contribution, please.
In many respects. And I think in a country like South Africa and other countries where you have huge discrepancies in access, where there isn't equal access to technology or to the internet, that also changes the nature of civil society mobilization, because most of the people who are oppressed don't have individual access to these tools for mobilization. But then you look at a country like Egypt, and that's very, very different. And similarly, countries in Asia. So you here, as civil society, have to look at economic and regulatory issues that can democratize access. If we want to use it as a tool, we've got to look at how much does it cost, where is their connection, how fast is that connection. And political events, forces and trends, I think the repression that you've mentioned applies a lot to the internet. We see increasing countries like Russia, similar countries, and censorship, filtering of content, attacks on bloggers, attacks on citizen journalists. And I think an interesting polarization that we have in the universe of the internet is also how you deal with the private sector. Because the internet as a terrain is not just governed by regulatory agencies and governments, but also by businesses. And sometimes these are large global companies like Facebook or Twitter, whose actions, and sometimes their actions through relations with governments, have enormous impact. So, China asked Google to censor its searches. Whether Google gives into that or not can completely transform how many people in China use the internet. And we see lots of examples of this. So as civil society activists, just finally, you talked about women's rights as a litmus test. In internet, in ABC, we often use sexual rights as the litmus test, because what we find is that if you want to see whether an internet is free in a country or not, then look at whether people can express themselves sexually or not.